this main theory, no political community without closure. You can imagine that this is very contested, of course, but we did go into it into our workshop. It's not possible to go into it here. But Walser is subscribing also to some other principles, namely proximity principle, which we just skipped. And he's arguing for his position with a lot of different analogies, and most of the other authors are following this approach by bringing in analogies. What is an association? And the starting point of Walser's was that might be very abstract things. A state, let's say, is a very abstract thing, or the international community is a very abstract thing, and we have nearly no direct experience with these institutions. But there are some institutions, some associations we are very familiar with, namely starting with this main example, our family, or being married, or being in a near friendship. And I'm so happy that my good friends, a girl, are here, and they will really know what I'm talking about. Oh, okay, and of course his favorite example would be clubs and business corporations. And he's making up all his main arguments by referring to these analogies, and then generalizing from these starting points to, the association he is, of course, most interested in, namely in states, to states. And of course, there's the big problem of being engaged in overgeneralization. What you say about family, what you say about marriage might be totally correct, but is it really the case that the state has the same properties? Is it really the case that your relation to the state is of the same kind as your relation to your own family? You know that most politicians like this analogy very, very much. They always appeal to, well, we are one family, and of course, and I'm the big boss of this family, and you know all these consequences. Okay, but at least is one principle he's subscribing to, and this I'm subscribing to, and this is the entrance point to my own discussion, is his so-called restriction principle. Namely, whatever you think about the different sorts of refugee policies applied by a particular society, by a particular community, these decisions are not absolute. They have to be restricted by the principle of mutual aid. And the mutual aid principle, we have already spelled it out in the beginning. It's obligatory if it is urgently needed, and if the risks and costs are relatively slow. Now the most central question in refugee ethics, according to Walser and the other figures we had discussed, is: can a political community exclude destitute and hungry, persecuted and stateless, in a word, necessitous men and women, simply because they are foreigners? And Walser's stance, I skip again something, is yes, it can. Can a political community exclude someone simply because he's a foreigner or she is a foreigner? And Walser's answer is yes. And that's, of course, the big question. And we had discussed this big question in our workshop very intensively. And and the main question is this yes, it can answer of Walser's compatible with what he calls his restriction principle? And if it is possible, if it is compatible, why? And if it is not compatible, why not? And this I just give it to you something as your homework. Here on the bottom of this page you find my email address, And if the other options don't work, just perhaps you write it down and you can ask me for the files and I will send it to you. Now the main central question is exclusion morally okay or not? Okay, and so we come to the central problem of refugee ethics, and the rest of my lecture is just spent for this central question. And it's of course a question for many involved, for many refugees, a question of life or death. And so my main question to you is, what's your stance? And of course I'm more interested in what is your stance than I'm interested in the question of what's the stance of my philosophical colleagues. Because you decide on what the reality in the world is, not philosophers. But nevertheless, of course, we are just speaking on philosophy of ethics, and so I just go very roughly into some approaches of philosophers to that point. Now, there are many pro-argumentations in philosophy and many contra-argumentations, as you can imagine. In philosophy, you will find everything, A and non-A, everything possible. And what's possible in Earth, it's a place for philosophers to be engaged. So it's not they should never be given the final word. Okay, now the two stars are just those names marked with the two stars. And if going to these stars, we should go into the two most famous book at present, namely Strangers in Our Midst, of the liberal nationalist, of the particularist David Miller and his opponent Joseph Carens. Ethics of immigration. But in our workshop we had restricted our discussion to a very, very helpful book combining both approaches, pro and contra, namely Wellman and Carens' discussion on or debating the ethics of immigration and putting exactly the right question into the very center: is there a right to exclude? Wellman is definitely saying yes, and Cole is saying definitely no, and that's exactly what we are just looking at now. Wellman's argument was a very, very good one, and it is a logically sound argument. By logically sound, it is meant if you accept the premises, you must, by force of logic, also accept the conclusion. Or to take it the other way around, if you don't accept the conclusion, you must deny at least one, maybe all, of the premises. But if you accept the premise, you are forced to accept the conclusion. So it's open, of course, to decline by opposing some premises. But it's very strong case that the argument itself is a logically conclusive one, and it goes like this. First premise: legitimate states do have political self-determination. Premise 2: no political self-determination without the right to freedom of association. Of course, that is what self-determination includes, that you can decide about what should be a member in your own country, let's say. Premise 3: no freedom of association without the right to exclusion. And from this it follows immediately, by the very logic of the argument, that legitimate states do have the right of exclusion. And what's the definition of legitimacy as used in the first premise? It doesn't refer to states in general, but just referring to legitimate states. And by legitimate states he means a state is legitimate only if it is abiding by, if it is following the human rights. And a logical consequence of this definition is, of course, if a state is violating human rights, it is not legitimate. And so then an argument for exclusion would not apply. And this is exactly the point at which his counter of Coles is starting from. Namely, freedom of international movement, as he says, is a human right. And second, unilateral exclusion is blocking this human right. So, a state with unilateral exclusion is not legitimate. Okay, now we have a strange situation. Namely, we have a clash between states' right to exclude and refugees' right to move, especially their right to move in. And so freedom of association, as spelled out so far, is incompatible, logically incompatible with freedom of movement. And he's right in saying that this central tension is the central tension in political theory and practice, not only in theory, but in our real life practice in our time. That's the tension between the tradition of the nation-state sovereignty and the authority of human rights. Okay, let me remind you that FA, freedom of association, and FM, freedom of movement, are not absolute rights, only presumptive rights. So there are two ways out of this contradiction. The first one is, if it comes to a conflict between them, and obviously we have a conflict in our tension, then freedom of association should be bigger, should count more than freedom of movement. Whereas Cole takes just the opposite stance. Freedom of movement is more important than freedom of association. You can't have it both ways. So, what's your choice? No, now I intended to leave it with this final question, but if you may give me another 5 minutes, okay, then thanks. Then I will give you my approach to how to get out of this contradiction, of this tension. Well, my second thoughts to this, which were enabled by our most helpful workshop, and thanks again, Alessandro, for encouraging me in taking part in this workshop. Okay, let me remind you that for for refugees in the sense of the Geneva Conventions of Refugee 51, there is no disagreement. Namely, in this case, the right to exclude, and so the right to restrict sovereignty is already restricted by international law. In the weak version, it goes, there is no refoulement possible, no possibility. It's not allowed to send refugees in the sense of Geneva refugees back to a country where they are again in the danger of being persecuted. You must allow them entrance. And in the stronger sense, as even followed by Germany, at least in different sorts, they are given a right, not just a chance, but the legal right of entrance in asylum to get a guaranteed refuge. That is asylum. And in this case, Wellman too would have to subscribe, and indeed he does subscribe to the other position, namely that freedom of movement, freedom of entry, in this special case is more important than freedom of association. And so in this restricted sense, there can't be a contradiction. But what about the refugees in a more general sense? And here I just refer to the very, very general, and I guess too general, but just for the sake of argument, let's just give it in. Refugee is anybody whose human rights are in deepest jeopardy. That would be the proposal of Wellman himself, who is against, let's say, letting people in just by applying. No, the state has the right to exclusion. Anybody whose human rights are in deepest jeopardy. That's maybe too wide, but okay, we can restrict it, and I will do it restrict more. Well, now the question left is, does the state have a right to exclude not refugees in the Geneva sense? This is already settled, he has no right. But has it the right to exclude refugees in this wider sense? Well, notice that Wellman's no to this question is based on his insistence on, again, our famous mutual aid principle being applied to these refugees. Namely, he takes, and I think he's right, and sticking to this logical point, namely this principle alone, the principle of mutual aid. You are obliged to help if there is no other possibility, if there is a necessity for this help. This principle does not imply that the state has to give up its right to exclude even needy refugees. And here we must make a distinction, I guess, namely refugees who can be helped and rescued without letting them in. Maybe helping them, what was the proposal of Walzer and from Wellman, even by making a military intervention, let's say in Iraq, in order to stop the refugees from Iraq. You are allowed and even obliged to go in by military. That's their position. And drawn from the very principle of mutual help. But we will come to this very dangerous point in discussion, I hope. Yeah, this first case, where the people can be helped without letting them in, must be distinguished from the very different case where they can't be helped without letting them in. They are already standing on your borders, let's say, yeah? Or there is no chance for them to get a rescue by military intervention. It would be too late, and so you can imagine all the different things. Okay, now, in the first case, it would be better to help, as Wellman says, maybe by exporting resources rather than importing needy people. A very sharp and very hard and very strong sentence. But I would say one has to subscribe to this conclusion. I do subscribe to it. But this does not mean that the question is settled already. Namely, the central question left open to decision for us is now, does Wellman's right to exclude even the exclusion, imply, it should mean, of course, imply even the exclusion of refugees in the strict sense of these are refugees in need of being let in. And here, okay, we have again these differences. Refugees in the sense of the Geneva Convention are a special sort of the wide sense. But yeah, now we have refugees in the strong sense of necessary, not only of help, but necessary of being let in. What about this special case? And okay, and here we have to make another distinction. You see, philosophers are always very fond of introducing new distinctions. But this is, of course, a very helpful and very necessary distinction from the start. But all of these people didn't make them, and so they got into the mess. And just in order to avoid the mess, you have to stick to this distinction. Namely, we should make a difference between exclusion from membership, to say to be naturalized in your country, you come in and getting the allowance of being a German citizen with all the full rights, or to be allowed of having residence on the country. And the same, of course, in the case of inclusion. And exclusion and inclusion has very different meanings. Relative to whether it's referring to membership, that's a strong sense of exclusion and inclusion, of course. And to territorial entrance on the other side. And now the main question left is just this one. It's not the question whether Wellman himself actually does, with respect to these strong refugees, subscribe to territorial inclusion of these strong refugees is counting more than territorial exclusion of refugees, but whether he does in fact this subscribe, but whether he ought or should do it. And of course the main question left for us is whether we should draw this conclusion. And my position is yes, definitely. And my reason is just by means of the mutual aid principle. It is true that we do have a general responsibility to protect, in the military sense, in the United Nations context, abbreviated as R2P, responsibility to protect, the main justification for humanitarian interventions, my other special field. But this is the same principle, but applied in a different area, in the area of refugee policy. Okay, my conclusion is, or proposal, let's say, we do have a general responsibility to protect, and this responsibility ought to hold not only when we think we can follow this responsibility by dropping bombs on other countries. There we usually follow this responsibility very soon. Why not also in the case of our strongest, most needy refugees? Thanks so much for your appreciated attention.
Thank you very much, Professor Dr. Megri, for this magnificent lecture. I'm sure everyone has enjoyed it as much as I did. I took so many notes, but I will keep from commenting because I'd like to give the floor to the audience. I would just like to point out the end of the lecture. In the end of the lecture, in fact, it was about this close link between philosophy and policy. In fact, I would say that this was about the philosophical underpinnings of policy and policy decisions that we see every day or that we do not see every day. So at the beginning, it was probably abstract, which was extremely interesting, but at the end, it comes very close to what we see every day when we talk about R2P, about residence, right to residence, as opposed to being naturalized. So these are all decisions which are very close to us, and I think for many among us, we are oblivious of the philosophy.